Okay, so I didn't think that I was going to be making another video on the recent developments in Stop Killing Games, but let alone one this quickly. But Pirate Software, aka Thor, has officially chimed in now that the movement has been gaining a lot more traction lately, and a lot more people have been calling him out for the nonsense that he's been spewing about the movement. So I thought that we would just kind of go through this response together. It's a bit of a long one, but I think that it is worth examining his perspective and just how poorly constructed many of these arguments are. Because, like, I do think it's important to view the opposition's arguments and what their perspective is on this kind of thing, because all that you can do by doing that is make your arguments and responses better by addressing these criticisms. But yeah, let's look at what he actually has to say about how this has developed and his perspective on this. So he starts off by talking about, he's been reading through all the posts because it's obviously been blowing up recently. Tons of people are calling him a liar or that he misrepresented the initiative. Now, to give him some credit here, I do think that calling him a liar is inaccurate. I've seen this even in my own comments section a few times, that some people are under the impression that he has intentionally been lying or misleading people about the initiative ever since he made his original videos criticizing Ross and Stop Killing Games and all of that. And I think that that is false. I think that that's putting way too much of a conspiratorial bent on it. He is not some kind of industry plant who is purposefully trying to screw over consumers or anything like that. I do not think that any of this was done intentionally. However, he did 100% misrepresent the initiative on numerous fronts throughout the videos that he has produced about it. So I do think that that is 100% accurate. Lots of content creators are dogpiling on him to get their pound of flesh. Again, that is true, and hell, I am one of those content creators. I'm not gonna lie about that. But again, when you are the opposition to a movement that is trying to improve consumer rights and protections, and a movement that is trying to preserve video games, I think it's understandable that people are going to take offense to your opinions. Let's dig into what he actually said and did. I put out 2 videos about 10 months ago. These videos are linked at the bottom of the post. Many people have not watched them and are just calling him a liar or attacking his characters. Give the videos a watch, read the initiative itself, and make a conclusion that you aren't copy-pasting from social media. That is, I think, an incredibly important and valid statement to make. Again, yeah, form your own opinions, watch the videos yourself, and, like, by all means, you can discuss it with other people who have already formed opinions, but I do think it is important to watch the videos yourselves so that you can see the full context, because taking somebody out of context doesn't really solve anything. Monetization is disabled, so he's not trying to, like, scam you or anything. In the first video, now, to be fair, I did make a direct response video originally about the second video, but I did not make one about the first video. So this is one that I haven't actually covered directly yet. In the first video, he goes through what an initiative is, how it's not law, and how it's a starting point for the whole process. So helps people understand this is the start of a conversation for change, and it can adapt later. This is, I believe, mostly accurate. I think the way that he talks about the initiative in that video, and in fact, we might actually just talk about the video a little bit more directly in a bit, but let's go through the Twitter post first. But I think that the way that he talks about it makes it seem like he's acting as if the initiative is a lot more authoritative than it really is, but, that's mostly accurate. Then he goes through the initiative and some of its goals from the official page for it, and I talk about the repercussions of them and how they should be implemented. As written, all games need to be left in a functional, playable state. This is where he kind of starts to leave out a few key details, because yes, he goes through the initiative and some of its goals, but he wildly misinterprets many of those goals, and he also seems to not understand what the basic idea of a functional playable state even is. Next, he brings up the crew and talks about the business around it, its sequels, and the size of its player base at the time of sunset. He somehow manages to do this without ever mentioning the fact that the crew has a single player component. Like that, like we actually, you know what? We need to go through that video after this, because, like, it's crazy that he didn't do that. And then he harshly critiques Ross's wording because they disparage the lawmaking process and lawmakers, which doesn't benefit the players of this movement in any way. So again, this is when he kind of focuses on this one slide that Ross has in his video, and all that this slide is really doing is talking about like how you kind of want to pander to lawmakers because that's usually how you get them to pass legislation. That's really all it was talking about. And then he acts as if he's like demeaning the lawmaking process and insulting lawmakers. And it's like dude, you are putting more thought into this than he was, and I think that you're over analyzing a very simple slide that was meant to just get a very general idea across to people who were wondering if it's even possible that this could pass. Like, it's not like that slide was meant to be presented to lawmakers to try and like demean them or any way. Like, he's wildly taking it out of context and wildly exaggerating the impact that that kind of thing would have. Then, in the second video, he talks about potential scenarios where a studio could be abused if the initiative was implemented as written. So, this is the one that I debunked more directly in my video from 10 months ago. I'll put a link to the description in that if you want to go back and check that out. But basically, his logic here, just to summarize it, is that if a studio is forced to have an end-of-life build, then that means that, in theory, a hacker known as 4chan could run in and sabotage the game by botting it, cheating, and just ruining the experience and killing off the player base. And then, once the player base is dead and gone, they can then use the end-of-life build to host their own servers, and in turn be able to then monetize those servers so that they can now profit off of someone else's work. Now, I don't know about you, but this is an insane proposition and hypothetical. Like, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Like, first of all, plenty of games already have community-run servers and don't have problems with bots and cheaters and whatnot trying to take them down and monetize it. Like, that's just an insane proposition. Secondly, why would a group try to kill their potential customer base so that they can host a game that they've actively driven people away from in order to then be able to host it themselves and monetize it? Like, that's literally counterproductive to the goal that he makes up for this theoretical hacker group. Which, by the way, even the prospect of a singular group doing this as a major coordinated effort alone is already such a wild proposition to begin with. But finally, the biggest problem with this argument is that of the games that already have community servers, so many of those games are actively saved from cheaters and bots and whatnot because of those community servers. He uses TF2 as an example, and TF2 is actually the perfect counterexample to this argument because many of TF2's official servers are being run over by bots and admins, and bots and cheaters and whatnot, because those servers are basically no longer being moderated. But the active community servers that have a much more closely knit community with much more active admins, those servers have mostly dealt with the bots and cheating problem very, very well because they have admins who could just manually go in and ban the players responsible. You know, it really just comes down to the fact that the community servers allow the community to be more active in the moderation of the game. And not to mention that when an end-of-life build gets put out, it's not like the hacker group would have exclusive access to it either. That's just not the case. So, like, if they tried to then release a server that was monetized to hell and back, somebody else could just host their own server that was monetized less, or not even at all, and then nobody would play on the hacker server, and everyone would play on the free server instead. You know, so every single aspect of this insane hypothetical just makes no sense whatsoever. So this entire like video that he put together to try and present this hypothetical as a serious threat is just an insane thought to think that it's even realistically achievable by any sense of the imagination. It's self-sabotaging, and it wouldn't even make sense in the real world if you put a modicum of thought behind it. But yeah, so to recap, as he tries to summarize, but this still goes on for quite a while, the main issue with this initiative is that it is broad in its approach to change the industry, and the exact language of the initiative, not the FAQ, requests that all games stay in a functional playable state. This is not feasible for all games at a technical level and could potentially restrict developers from making online-only games like MMOs, MOBAs, etc., etc. That isn't true. It's just not true. Like, functional playable state... You know, we'll go into this more when we talk about his video. This has the potential to restrict future developers from making kick-ass experiences because it locks a weight on their designs. All that the initiative is trying to do is force developers to actually consider end-of-life plans when they develop a game. A key important part of the initiative is that it is not retroactive. Any game that has already been made or is currently active would not be affected by the initiative, because it would be unreasonable to expect a developer to suddenly have to build an end-of-life mode for the game when the game has already been out and is potentially not even popular enough to support the resources that it would take to create an end-of-life build. But if end-of-life builds are required from the start of development, then at that point it just comes down to having good management. If you're building a multiplayer game after this legislation would come into effect, then part of the cost of doing business would be to consider what your end-of-life plans would be. And when you're making an end-of-life build, making those plans at the start of development makes it a million times easier to implement those plans at the end of the product's life. Because yes, it is hard to implement those changes retroactively in a framework that wasn't designed around it, but now you could design the framework around it. And it could be something as simple as making it possible to host a community server while still having the, main servers run by the developer or the publisher or whatever, that run for the game's primary lifespan, and then once that's done, you have the community hosted servers that you worked on ages ago, and you just flick a switch and turn those on. Like, that would make things a million times easier. So, like, the fact that he is ignoring this entire core aspect, that it is only going to be taken into effect for games that start development, not come out, but start development after the legislation comes into effect, like, that changes the perspective on this completely. So then he talks about some stuff, disinformation about his character. I don't really care about this. Like I said, I don't really care about attacking the man. I care about attacking his arguments. Although I do think that he has kind of shown himself to have a questionable character as a result of all this. But yeah, and then he talks about the first these are the links to the two videos, and then this is proof of, like, his minimum wage claim that he makes later on in this section somewhere. And then, yes, he posts an image that talks about how, yes, the initiative requires publishers to leave said video games in a functional playable state. And this is, I'm just me pointing out the fact that, yeah, he claims he's not running away from the discourse when, he actively, like, Ross reached out to him 10 months ago when he first made these videos. And he shut him down. All Ross wanted to do was talk to Thor directly and be like, hey, I think you got some things wrong. If you're willing to chat, I'm willing to clear some things up for you so that, we can have an honest discussion about this. And, at the very least, even if you're still against it, you can be more informed in how you're against it and make better arguments about why you're against it. Like, it would be a good thing for him to engage in that discourse, and he just kind of ran away from it and decided to not partake in it. So that's why, I was typing up that tweet. Although, honestly, I don't even know if I want to post it, just because I hate having to use Twitter. But, maybe I'll post it after I make this video. But yeah, let's actually now go back and talk about this. This is his first video on Stop Killing Games, and I want to go through a few key points of it to point out the exact instances where he is, in fact, misrepresenting the initiative and otherwise forming terrible arguments about it. Okay, so this is Thor's original first video that he made talking about Stop Killing Games. Like I said, I never actually went over this video myself back in the day, so I'm going to do it now. And yeah, I'm not going to show the entire video, even at a higher frame rate, simply because that would take way too long. But feel free to watch the entire video just so that you can confirm that I'm not actually taking anything out of context here. That way, you could be sure that what he is saying is in fact what he is saying, and that it is factually untrue. So let's start off with the first point that Ross makes, where essentially he is misrepresenting what the Stop Killing Games movement is about.
The reason why I have a problem with Stop Killing Games is specifically it starts the wrong conversation. If we're trying to kill off the practice of developers putting together a live service game, pitching it as a single player experience, and then taking away support in the future, this ain't it. And
that's because it isn't. So, right off the bat, Thor assumes that the Stop Killing Games initiative is about this one very specific thing about trying to stop live service games from being sold as single-player games. And technically that is covered under the purview of Stop Killing Games, but it is not what the initiative is about. The initiative, as he goes into detail later in the video, is about leaving games in a functional playable state. That's all it is. That's literally all it is. It's not about trying to ensure that this one specific thing is avoided. And he's again, as Ross said, I have no idea where he got that from. He kind of made up that the initiative was about that, and then decided that the initiative was worded poorly if it was about that, but that's because it's not about that. But okay, now let's move on to his next point, which is actually about addressing the whole, leaving games in functional playable states, which is actually what Stop Killing Games is about.
Video games in a functional playable state. Specifically, the initiative seeks to prevent the remote disabling of video games by the publishers before providing reasonable means to continue functioning of said video games without the involvement from the side of the publisher. This isn't always possible in all video games, and it doesn't call out the specific practice that this is supposedly trying to defeat. It is incredibly vague and will damage all live service games. How would you keep League of Legends in a functional playable state? You'd have to re-architect the
Okay. A lot of things here, but okay, let's address them real quick. So, leaving games in a functional playable state is purposefully that is actually vague, and that is purposefully vague because, as Ross points out in his original video, there's not really a better way to phrase that, because it's meant to be open-ended so that different developers can take different approaches that would be more appropriate to the given game in question. Some games might need to be rendered into a single-player mode, like, say, Titanfall 2. You could probably just disable the multiplayer entirely and leave just the campaign mode single-player, and people might be happy. Other games, you might want to make it so that people can host private servers. Other games, you might be able to set it up so that it has a LAN system. But what really gets me, and what is really funny, is the fact that he uses League of Legends specifically as an example. Thor, you realize that League of Legends has an offline mode, right? Like, it's not... I don't think it's accessible to the average players, but how do you think they hold League of Legends tournaments? They don't just connect to the the normal League of Legends servers and play tournaments where they risk having lag and latency and ping issues and whatnot. The servers are hosted in an offline LAN environment. The code already exists that if League of Legends shut down tomorrow, they could literally just release the stuff they use for tournaments publicly, and the game would be playable offline. Like Thor, it already exists. That they wouldn't have to even do anything. It would take zero effort. I don't know how he manages to do this, but he always somehow manages to pick the worst possible games to use for his counterexamples. But even if we weren't talking about League of Legends specifically, that already has an offline mode that they could just release publicly. Are you really telling me that a game that has had a massive multiplayer component like this is incapable of developing a basic offline LAN system. Like, seriously? Like, any time that anybody makes a game of that scale, because, like, making multiplayer games is hard and expensive. And, like, that's the thing, that, like I mentioned earlier, you, this wouldn't affect existing games. This would only affect games made after that started development after the legislation was put in place, which means that they would be developing the games from day one with an end of life goal or end of life plan in mind for when that day eventually comes. So they could just make a LAN mode from the start and they wouldn't have to then rework anything for when that day eventually comes. If they ended up getting into that situation, that would be the fault of the developer itself and likely poor management. So at that point, you're really kind of like, it would only add a minor cost to development, and that cost would be dramatically reduced by being planned out well from the start. Okay, now moving on only a little bit. This is a more minor point, but I think it is worth looking at. How he describes the whole, like, online architecture thing, and it's a bit of a non sequitur, sure, but I think this is still worth analyzing a little bit to kind of view how he structures this argument and how it doesn't really make any sense to the points being made.
You'd have to re-architect the entire game. The game is what is called a client server. So in client-server models, there's a server and there's a client, and all of the math, all of the game, everything happens on the server. The client just displays it. And the reason we want to do it that way is so that you can't teleport around and do a billion damage. You don't trust the client. You trust the server. The client just displays what it's told, right? So if we wanted to re-architect this, we'd have to take all of that server logic, push it back out into the client, and somehow make that playable in a multiplayer-only video game. That doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, so he basically covered the fundamentals of how a server-client online infrastructure works, and then tried to make the argument that it's just impossible to take that server logic and put it on a client and somehow make that a playable thing. And that, again, is just not true. Like, you know what? Actually, I'm gonna steal Thor's thing. Let's pull up some MS Paint Photoshop nonsense and draw some white boxes real quick. Okay, so as Thor was talking about initially, what he is talking about is this idea of, like, server client online infrastructure. So the idea is that you have your client and then you have your server, and then you have, like, a bunch of clients that these are all represent, like, the different people that would be in a multiplayer game, and these are all connecting to the same server online in order to play together. And the reason why we do this is effectively to reduce the odds of somebody being able to cheat, because the idea is that each of these clients is effectively only sending the player's inputs and not the actual game logic. And then what the server does is the server has a version of the game that it is running within the server, right? So it's kind of as if you have a bunch of different people playing with their own keyboards and mice on the same computer. So all of these different people are all playing one game that is here, and then that game's output is being sent back to each of the clients, right? But what's actually happening here is just the game's logic. Like, when you're playing a game like, say, Titanfall, which has both a single player and a multiplayer game, the single player game is running the game's logic with how the gunplay works and everything. And then the server, when you play a multiplayer game, is now the one that is running the game's logic. Now, it is a little bit more complicated than this, because when you're playing online, all of these individual clients are actually all individually playing their own version of the game locally. And then the server is the effective authority of how the online environment works. So when somebody jumps or something in one of these games, what's actually happening is, first, your version of the client will run that code and try to perform the action immediately in order to reduce the perception of latency or lag for your version of the client. Then your input, so hitting the spacebar, is sent to the server, and then the server is the thing that processes that input, and then that makes you jump on the server's version of the game. Then the server sends that data back to the client so that it can go, okay, now you're here. But because the client was already running the same game as the server, you already have the info that you jumped. And so there is no, even though it might take, a half second or whatever, if you have really bad ping, for you to get that data back from the server, because you're running your own mini version of the game, it doesn't feel nearly as laggy to you because you're able to accurately predict what happens. Now, if somebody tries to cheat and make it so that they can jump, 1,000 miles in the air, then what will happen is that they will hit the space bar, and then on their version of the client, they'll jump 1,000 feet in the air. Then, when the server gets that input, they will jump normally because the server doesn't have the client's cheats, and then they will only jump a normal amount in the air. Then the server will send that data back to the client, and even though you initially jumped 1,000 feet in the air, all of a sudden you will snap back down to the ground and be at your normal jump height, because that's where the server has decided that your character is supposed to be. And then obviously the server can then detect that there was a mismatch and can figure out that you've been cheating. So that's why the server works this way. The actual complicated stuff about this whole system is mostly just these bars in the middle about how it actually connects to each of the clients. That's the actual hard part. What the server is actually running is just the same thing as the game itself. And there are other methods of doing it. And the main reason why we do this is, like I said, and just explained, is to stop cheating. But let's say we no longer care about cheating. All we care about is making a version of this system that works for an end-of-life build that no longer requires the support of the developers. Well, that's what peer-to-peer is for. And peer-to-peer effectively replaces the server with another client. Then you have a bunch of clients that all connect to this one client. And then this client is effectively now treated as the host. If you ever played things like Halo 2 back in the day, I'm pretty sure this is the kind of networking that they would use, where you would have one player that is considered the host, and now everybody else is connecting to that person's console or computer or whatever, and that computer is now acting like the server in this version of the game, and it works the exact same. Like, you still have to deal with this whole connection aspect of it, but this client now is effectively the authority. Now, like I said, obviously this has the downside of allowing much more easy cheating, because if you are the host, then now if you put in a cheat that allows you to jump 1,000 feet in the air, well, then now you're able to do that, and all of your other friends who are trying to play with you won't be able to stop you. There's also, even if you don't cheat, there is this thing called host advantage, where effectively you're playing the game at zero latency, because your version of the game is the authoritative one, whereas everybody else is playing with some level of ping, so you're going to be at a slight advantage no matter what. All of these things are bad, and this is why we use server authoritative infrastructure for most online games these days. But when it comes to just trying to preserve a game, this is perfectly good enough, especially if you're only playing with people that you trust to not cheat in the first place. This is really all we need, and tons of games already have support for this, or like came out with support for this. Like, there's no reason to think that this is some kind of impossible, unachievable goal, or even that it's impossible for games to be reworked into this structure. It really isn't that different from this. Like, all you're really changing is what computer is hosting the game. Do you have a computer that is owned by the developers that they can ensure there are no cheats on, or do you just have a computer that is owned by a consumer that is hosting the game? And again, there are some additional complications. Some servers and some games are very complicated and big, so you need big, powerful computers in order to meaningfully host a server, especially if we're talking about things like an MMO that might have hundreds of players connecting, and obviously you in turn need a good internet in order to support that. But again, these aren't problems for the developers anymore when we're talking about an end-of-life build. That could be up to the consumer to solve those problems themselves. And again, if all the consumer wants to do is host like an MMO server or a PvP server for like Overwatch or whatever when it eventually dies, then this is good enough. Okay, now that my parody is out of the way and I've tried to help clarify that issue, let's move on to his thoughts on the crew, which I think are particularly fascinating because he somehow manages to miss the entire point that the crew had a major single player campaign that was completely separate from its online component.
The crew was actually created in 2014, which, much to the hatred of all of us oldies on the internet, was 10 years ago. Oh. So this was an online-only racing video game developed by Ubisoft Ivory Tower and Ubisoft Reflections and published by Ubisoft. So all Ubisoft, right? With that in mind, it said it was a scaled-down recreation of the contiguous United States and included both role-playing and large-scale multiplayer elements. So it had a massive multiplayer component to it. It is an online-only service-based game, and they shut it down 10 years later. On March 31st, 2024, Ubisoft shut down the game's servers, rendering the game unplayable, which is normal for live service games. The only thing that I can see in here that could be a problem is if they posted it as not an online-only experience. But everything that I found online shows that the game was always marketed as online only. If you're going
Again, so yes, the game had a massively multiplayer component. It had a multiplayer focused element to it. But if you actually go to the Wikipedia page for the crew, apologies for the flashbang, the crew had a single player component. Like, if you actually go to the gameplay section, it had a single-player campaign that was up to 20 hours long and involved a story and everything. And even the single-player element of the game was rendered unplayable when they shut down the internet connection. So this is literally an example of what he said earlier about games that are sold as live service games but are actually single player games. And yet he seems to completely neglect this aspect of the crew when he's talking about it, and I don't know why. Again, maybe, like, I don't think he was intentionally lying about it. I think he just didn't bother putting enough thought to even read the rest of the article about it. And this one fact radically changes the way that you look at this situation. Because, yeah, there was a multiplayer component to it, and trying to preserve that multiplayer element would have been a little bit harder. They would have had to post servers and make it possible to connect with, like, LAN and whatnot. And I do think that that still should have been done. But at the very least, at the bare minimum, one would think that they should at least have made it possible to play the single-player campaign that did not require an actual online gameplay element, and yet it nevertheless required a constant internet connection to play for no good reason. And actually, if you look further into it about the shutdown and lawsuit, there actually is a section here, and to be fair, I don't know exactly how old this part of the article is, so maybe this part wasn't written when he originally made his video, but very specifically, it was allegedly discovered that the game had code for an actual offline mode to play the single player without the online component, which only goes to show just how meaningless the online requirement was for those elements of the game. So that further shows just how insanely anti-consumer this whole situation was. And then furthermore, and I'm pretty sure this wasn't written at the time, but there is a revival effort made by people to try and reverse engineer a server emulator. And they're effectively trying to make it possible to even play the online element of the games now, even though the games have been shut down. And this only further goes to show how bad his argument saying that, like, oh, it's so impossible to rework these games into having only single player or reworking their online to work for an end-of-life build. If fans are able to reverse engineer these servers, and this is far from the only example of it, there are plenty of other examples of fans managing to reverse engineer server binaries like this, and so the fact that fans are able to do this, it should be trivial for companies to actually implement this. And again, even more trivial when, like I have reiterated multiple times now, the goal of the initiative is to make it so that only games that start development after it is passed have to do this, which means that they can be developing a client-compatible server emulator on their own in-house while making the real main servers, which would make it a lot cheaper and easier to implement, and then they can simply hand those out when they're ready to go. Okay, I don't know how many more points in this video I want to break down, but I think that this last one is probably the biggest and most important one to talk about.
If you try to tell me that every studio needs to run their live service game indefinitely or not run one at all, then no one's going to run them. And we're going to miss out on adventures like Final Fantasy XIV. And even though I don't play anymore, League of Legends or any.
So this is the biggest misconception, and Ross has reiterated this multiple times himself in his own video. Nothing about the initiative is trying to ask developers to try and support these games indefinitely. That is obviously an insanely irresponsible and unrealistic goal to try and shoot for, because yeah, obviously no developer can last forever. Developers get shut down, and yeah, they're obviously not going to be able to continue hosting servers when they no longer exist. But as I already talked about with my basic, peer-to-peer networking solution and whatnot, which has existed for decades, this isn't some new fangled concept that has never existed before. There are obvious solutions that developers could employ in order to put out games that can be hosted by the community and run indefinitely without any kind of issues. There is no reason to think that the initiative, or anyone for that matter, is trying to unrealistically expect that developers should be able to support their games forever. I don't even know where he managed to get that point from. It just kind of comes out of nowhere in this video. Like, again, feel free to watch the entire video for yourself. I don't know why he ends up going to this point, because it's just obviously nonsensical, and it's nothing but a straw man argument to make the Stop Killing Games initiative look worse. Now, one last point that I think is worth going over, just for the sheer irony of it, is this video that Thor put out about a week ago, actually, as of the time of this recording, where he talks about his sadness over the fact that a game that he loves is being shut down. It's this game called Meet Your Maker, and it's effectively a dungeon building game where, like, you have players try to create levels that are super hard to clear, and then you can effectively attack other players' bases in order to try and, steal their resources and level up and, all that jazz. There's been plenty of games that kind of follow this format, so you're probably familiar with the general concept. And the sheer irony, of course, is that, like, oh, the game is being shut down, so it'll be unplayable. And obviously Stop Killing Games is all about game preservation, and yet he's somehow against the idea that this game can even be preserved. He even made a comment specifically talking about the idea that, like, this is a user-generated game. Stop Killing Games cannot preserve it, because a game like this cannot be playable with just a small group of players. It needs tons of people making levels constantly. And that is not true in the slightest. Like, there are so many games that are similar to this in general concepts. Mario Maker, Little Big Planet, I think Guitar Hero even had, like, custom levels at some point. All of these games that have customizable levels and whatnot, if those games get shut down, then the game becomes completely unplayable, and all of those custom levels are lost forever. And that is, I think, inarguably a bad thing. Now, if the game is preserved in some way so that you can at least play it offline, and then somebody, say, saves a bunch, like, maybe they can't save all of the levels because it might be too much data, but they could at least try to save as many levels as possible and make it downloadable so that you have a ton of levels to play through, and then you get to experience what this game was like, with all of those downloaded levels. That can be a great way to preserve the game. Yes, you won't be mimicking the height of its popularity, but that's still something worth preserving if you love this game, is it not? Like, it's crazy to me that he thinks that, like, oh no, there's nothing we can do, when on top of everything else, he is a massive influencer with a rapidly diminishing but still above 2.5 million subscribers. He could easily use that influence to keep this game alive by himself if he had access to hosting servers like this. Like, imagine if, say, once a month, he had his Discord community or whatever put together a bunch of levels for him to play on stream. And then those levels could be made available to everybody else so that they would all have new levels to play. That would be a great way that you could preserve the game within a close community so that a bunch of people could still continue to enjoy it and create new levels for other people to enjoy years after the game shuts down. So that's an even better state of preservation than what people have done for games like Mario Maker and Little Big Planet and whatnot. Like, that is an amazing way to preserve this game, and yet he just shuts down that idea despite him supposedly loving this game to bits. It doesn't make any sense. I don't understand the cognitive dissonance here. Like, it to him, it seems like it's an all or nothing deal. Either you preserve the game at the peak of its popularity with every single feature whatsoever, or you don't. And like, that's the unrealistic thing. Like, obviously it's unrealistic to try and replicate and preserve a game at the height of its popularity with every single advertised feature 100% intact. But that's why Stop Killing Games doesn't try to do that. It just wants to keep the game in some kind of functional, playable state, even if not every single feature is still going to be available, you know? So this is the exact kind of game that is 100% preservable. And I don't understand Thor's reasoning here. Like, would you not, once this game shuts down, presumably you won't be able to play anything. Like, the servers will be down, you can't download levels, and you won't be able to do anything. Would it not be better to have some way of at least being able to play the existing levels? Because, like, then, even if there's nothing new for you, because you've literally played every single level that's already existed, would it not be nice to be able to go to, like, a friend who has never heard of this game after it shuts down and be like, hey, you know, there's this game I really loved that unfortunately it's down, so there's no new levels being made for it, but I've downloaded it and I've got a bunch of my favorite levels that other people made from ages ago, and you can now download and play through those levels so that you can experience some of the fun that I experienced back in the day. Would that not be an amazing experience to preserve? Like, why must we throw it in the garbage? It makes no sense. So yeah, I think that will be the end of it for today. Like I said, like, I don't understand Pirate Software's and Thor's, vehement disliking of the Stop Killing Games movement. It makes like no sense to be so against game preservation. And like, he claims to be on the side of the developers, but at the same time, the way he talks about, like, oh, it's impossible to create server architecture that can be supported for an end-of-life build. And it's like, it so is. So many games already have it set up. Why are you acting like it's this impossible new thing that would be insanely hard for developers to achieve? It's just not true. And yet he keeps doubling down on these terrible arguments, no matter how many times people debunk him. And he's acting like, he mentioned on one of his streams, I was like, oh, all of a sudden people are hating on me for things I said 10 months ago, like it's my fault. Like, yeah, it is your fault because you stopped the momentum back when the initiative was first getting started. And, and again, it's impossible to know. We don't know for sure where the initiative would be today if it wasn't for Thor. But one thing that I think we do know for sure is that it would have been in a better spot if it wasn't for Thor. And I think that more people also would have spoken out about it if it wasn't for Thor. Because I think that Thor, indirectly, because of the authority that he held at the time and how much people trusted him, a lot of people assumed that what Thor was saying had a lot of weight behind it, and so lots of other content creators that had a ton of influence just decided to not bother talking about it. So Thor definitely had a huge negative impact on this entire movement, and I think that is something he needs to own up to and recognize. Now, he might not see that as a bad thing, but it is still something that definitely happened. Anyways, I think that this is going to be my last video on this for a little while, at least, hopefully, unless some more insane drama happens to come out of this, in the next day or two. But yeah, I think I'm gonna stop talking about Thor. Like, unless he does like a massive 180, I doubt that anything he says is going to be worthwhile to examine, because it's probably just gonna parrot all the same things he's already said before. So I'm not gonna. This is gonna be my last video shitting on Thor. I'm not gonna talk about him anymore after this. I might talk about Stop Killing Games just because I just want to continue spreading that word. That we've actually gotten a ton more signatures in the last few days, thanks to all the press that has been made about it. Like, I think they got like over 50,000 signatures in a day, which is like only a fraction, a significant fraction of the amount of signatures they still need, because like we're at about 500,000. So like 50,000 in like just a couple of days. That's a tenth of the way there in a couple of days. So like it's possible we might be able to pull this off if we're able to keep that momentum going. So maybe this actually is a little bit more optimistic than it was when I was making my previous video yesterday. So I guess we'll just have to sit and see how it plays out. But like I said, I'll put a link to Ross's videos and the initiative in the description. If you live in the EU or you know anybody who lives in the EU, please spread it around. And like I said, like you can spread this video if you want to help debunk some of Thor's arguments, but the important thing is to spread Ross's original videos, because they are much more informative and detailed about what exactly the initiative is and how it's going to work. And obviously they're going to talk a lot more specifically about what you should do and whatnot. So by all means, go to Ross's channel, Accursed Farms, watch those videos, sign the initiative, and maybe we can make this thing work. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one. I swear I'm going to make some normal content after this.